Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studio, you're listening to For Your Consideration,
the podcast featuring roundtable discussion reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics.
I'm your host, Mike.
And I'm Dustin.
And a big hello to all our listeners who are catching the show on YouTube, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Google Play, and wherever great pods are cast. Thanks so much for joining us. Also, if you're listening to the show via iTunes, we would encourage you to rate and review the show while you're there. Kind of helps us out, so appreciate that.
Thanks in advance.
If you've listened to the show before, you know what to expect, and if this is your first time here, thanks for joining us, and be warned, spoilers aplenty. So on this week's show, we'd like to welcome a guest, somebody who I've done some podcasting with before in the Scooby-Doo corner of the podcastosphere. He's the co-host and co-creator, I guess, of the Scooby-Doos or Scooby-Don'ts podcast. Welcome to the show, Billy Seguire.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you.
So in our usual FYC tradition, anybody who is a guest on the show gets to choose the movie that we cover. So, Billy, what movie did you choose for us this time around?
I chose the movie Kairo, also known as Pulse, from 2001.
AKA that movie where ghosts don't quite know what it means to be immortal.
It's a tough movie to summarize, isn't it?
That's why we go with the dumb summaries.
Yeah.
So, rolling credits on Kairo, it was directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa. It was produced by Shun Shimizu, Seiji Okuda, Ken Unui, and Atsuyuki Shimoda. It was written by Kiyoshi Kurosawa. It starred Kumiko Eso, Haruhiko Kato, Koyuki, and Kurumi Arisaka. Music was by Takafumi Haketa. Cinematography was by Junichiro Hayashi. It was edited by Junichi Kikuchi. It was distributed by Toho, and it was released on the 3rd of February, 2001 in Japan. The film actually didn't get an American release for I think another 4 or 5 years because the Weinsteins blocked it from getting released until they could get Pulse out into theaters, their American remake. And so yeah, it finally made it into theaters in a very kind of limited release, and a few people saw it like in a closet somewhere. Yeah,
it deserves so much more.
Critical reception to the movie was strong, and Dustin?
And like so many of our films, it has made it onto the BFI's Sight and Sound poll of best movies of all time, tying for 894th on the critics poll.
And it placed at number 65 on Time Out's Top 100 list. So, Kairo.
Yeah.
Billy, as the guest, you get to go first. What did you think about Kairo?
So, I saw this film for the first time ever in October of 2017. Amelia and I, who is my co-host on Scooby-Doos or Scooby-Don'ts, were doing a Halloween horror marathon, and this movie was recommended. It's kind of incredible to me of what it is with when it was made. I think it does an incredible job of capturing our relationship to life online. It does a great job of capturing depression. And it's somehow both it's not really a horror movie. It's more of an supernatural apocalypse movie with a love story.
I wouldn't necessarily call that much of a love story. They almost sort of default to each other. But I would certainly agree that it's supernatural apocalypse movie. I think that's actually a pretty apt title for it.
I kind of agree as well, yeah.
Now, there's a lot in it, I think, especially in the last half hour, that was very much borrowed for 28 Days Later.
I'm trying to remember what year 28 Days Later came out.
I want to say 2003 right off the top of my head.
I'm hitting the internet.
Might be a little early, but I do think this beat it.
Came out the year after.
Oh, okay. So the question just remains if Danny Boyle had seen it.
Well, Alex Garland wrote 28 Days Later, so the question is, did Alex Garland see it? Which is probably unlikely, considering
the limited release.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that, like, I would say it's more than a writing thing, because for me, like, there's the one shot at the end where he's trying to take a can of soda out of the vending machine, and the camera kind of just pans around to the empty streets, and I really feel like that's a shot that I've seen in 28 Days Later before.
I think, yeah, because Cillian Murphy does kind of wander around with his, like, little plastic shopping bag collecting provisions as he's going.
Yeah, and it might be coincidental. It might just be that is how a smart filmmaker films that feeling in that environment, and that was a universal shot. But it was very interesting to me to see that.
I honestly never thought of it while watching the movie, but having you make that comparison, I'm thinking of it now, and I'm trying to figure out how exactly this movie could have influenced the other movie that came out, like, so close afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly we've seen that more often in apocalypse-type movies, or Walking Dead. You'll have just the wandering through the empty streets. It's a good way to set up that isolation and that notion that this once bustling city is now dead.
Yeah, especially in once bustling city, an environment that's usually so filled to the brim with people.
That was one thing that I liked about the movie, was this is Tokyo.
Yeah.
And, like, Tokyo, what is there, like 1 billion people in Tokyo? And there was so few people in this movie.
There were some at the beginning when you'd have classrooms filled with people, or when the one woman jumps off the smokestack in that industrial area, and there's a crowd that suddenly starts forming, but about halfway through, you pretty much see nobody.
Yeah, it's really just our main characters, which I'm also going to say is very smart filmmaking, because that cuts down on your extras budget just immediately.
I think it's a plus and a minus for the film, because you have that small cast. Okay. I have a very complicated mixed reaction to this movie.
I before we really delve into it, because I kind of just jumped in with some analysis, but, like, I've seen this movie before. What did you two think of it? Now that you've seen it, have you both seen it for the first time?
We did, yeah.
No, I did not. I saw it years and years ago. I was doing sort of the same thing. I was looking at a bunch of foreign movies, specifically Asian horror movies that had North American remakes. And I was watching a lot of those back to back, and Pulse admittedly was one that I had the fewest memories of. I had a vague notion of the suicide in the industrial area from the remake and the woman jumping off in the original, but I could barely remember anything about it.
I'm so sorry you had to see that remake.
You know, people are going to hate me for this, but I saw the remake before I saw the original, and I didn't mind it.
Okay, you did. Okay.
I have to revisit it. Dustin and I were both talking about revisiting it after watching this one, because this is a movie where I liked what it was saying and I liked what it was trying to do, but I didn't like the movie.
Okay.
And I felt that Kurosawa, he was more fascinated with the ideas that he was putting forth, which I felt that he actually hammered pretty solidly in the first 15 minutes of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And then it dragged on for like another hour and 45 without any real character development, without much narrative, and some very bizarre editing.
I'm not going to argue with you on those points at all, because it is a very metaphysical film. It's pretty much just has a thesis, and it's using the plot to examine that thesis. And when I say plot, again, that's pretty loose. I don't want to say tone poem, because that's very pretentious.
It had so many moments in it where you would have a character, like, alone on a bus or on a street, and there would be this very, tonally appropriate and strange music playing, and it was kind of like, this is a moment, and then it would just cut to something else entirely in the middle of the song. Like, it didn't feel like it actually came to any kind of...
Oh, I loved that, though.
Did you? It just felt like someone changed the channel.
Yes! Or clicked away from, like, a YouTube video or something.
Fair enough. That's an interesting way to look at it.
I was seeing that from a digital perspective. Of that was, all right, they've closed the window now. They've flicked over to something else. I thought that was very intentional about our relationship with technology, where we can just flick away.
But there were a lot of things like...
Mid-conversation, they'd also leave. They wouldn't complete a thought. The the one woman goes over to the main character's house in order to check out his screen cap, and nothing comes of that. They don't tell you anything. They're not like, oh, here, I found it. No, it's just, they just cut it short, like
she
mid-sentence.
She sits at the computer for a few minutes, and then doesn't she just sort of get up and pontificate, and then it cuts to something else?
And it has nothing to do with the reason that she came there whatsoever. He's just cleaning up a bit, and I find that the film is filled with a lot of odd moments like that, and interspersed you'd have some very legitimately creepy segments of really dark moving shapes or repeating images. Most anything, any video of the Forbidden Room, I adore, and I adore the sort of low soundtrack in the background, unless it gets cut off, because I find that very jarring, takes me out of the film.
And Dustin doesn't normally mention or notice music. So the fact that he noticed it really stood out.
I also while we're just on this topic of music, I really liked how the soundtrack was used, because I found there were kind of two elements to it. There was one which was the very tonal, synthy electronic score, but at other times you do get these strings that are almost Hitchcock in nature. Especially nearer to the beginning of the film than the end, when it is more of an organic piece, particularly when she's climbing those steps up to the building. I don't know if that's something either of you found at all, but I thought the way that it used both those styles of scoring to be really interesting.
I liked the music. I liked the way it was used. I liked its placement. I liked the fact that it switched around from choral singing to strings, like you said, to weird industrial, groaning sounds. And
one thing that when it came to the abrupt stopping, there's a few times when I thought it was extremely appropriate, such as when it did a zoom in on the one character's face and all you could hear was the ghost saying, just really quietly. See, there it worked perfectly, because it captured a mood and it gave an extremely creepy vibe, and I love creepy stuff. But to just do a scene transition, I found it really jarring.
And this is one of those things too where the movie, and I know this might have been part of the point, but the movie doesn't really have any internal logic. You have characters who have crazy knowledge about what's going on, on the other side in the afterlife.
And they drop it like an M. Night Shyamalan exposition bomb.
The and one character who, if this was M. Night Shyamalan, that would have been played by M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah. and you have, the ghosts who they don't want to kill you because they're already in, an overpopulated place, and they don't want more souls coming, but then they leave you in your loneliness, which makes you so depressed that you kill yourself.
Which seems extremely wrong when it comes to the notion of how to prolong our lives.
And then other people would just fade into ash, and
it's supposed to be the pit of despair and loneliness that renders us immortal somehow, and apparently that's done by dispersing our ashes, our essence. And I can see how it can be made into a metaphor for our existence on the internet, how we're so depersonalized. You have those forbidden rooms that you see on the screens, and what you're seeing are other people, but you don't, as they say in the one point of the film, they exist, or do they exist? You see them there, but are they real people? I don't know. We're not really interacting with them. That's a pretty apt metaphor for the internet and how we're dealing with each other. But then the motivations of the ghosts and how anything's actually working doesn't necessarily make much sense, and people's reactions and the way they become lonely seems extremely arbitrary. And
that part is a little bit loose. I saw it as it was kind of using depression as a virus, so that in the way that computer virus might be, it's transferred around that way through any infected computers. And then there were the two ways that people died, which was essentially either just fading into nothingness, which was the immortality, or people actually killing themselves and committing suicide, which I kind of saw those ones as the ones who were like, no, I'm not going to be lonely and I'm not going to do all this. I'm getting out this way, and you can't have me here, immortal. Which was kind of like, there's neither one is right, and neither one is really a happy ending for the characters.
But then you have moments like at the end where that C-130 comes crashing down into Tokyo. Mm-hmm. One would have presumed that whoever was flying the plane disintegrated into a black smear somewhere, and
that made the engines explode somehow.
Yeah, somehow the plane is on fire.
I'm not quite sure what happened with the engines.
But why?
Some geese became ghosts.
Unless that character had been like touched, earlier, and because it usually takes a while for this effect to take them over and to sort of dissipate them into these black smears and shadows on walls and floors and stuff. So I suppose if that pilot had been affected in the past and it just finally overtook him and he disintegrated and that's when the plane is crashing.
Or if he used the plane as a way to commit suicide.
Oh, right. There could still be someone in the plane.
Well, otherwise why would he be flying it? I'm just going to fly from here to here for fun. There's got to be passengers.
But the plane was still on fire.
Yeah.
That made both of us kind of angry at the end. Like, why isn't it?
I mean, I loved the shot, divorced of logical reason.
Oh, I actually enjoy those kind of shots too. I'm not gonna lie.
But I can see where you would have troubles with it if you were like looking for, all right, what is the in-universe plot and narrative that actually is happening beat for beat here, because it doesn't really provide that.
I actually felt that some of the things that you mentioned, like the depression as a virus, I felt the American film hammered that home a lot more solidly than this one did.
Yeah, but I feel like it also removed a lot of the meaning that this film gave and went for a lot more of literal answers that didn't matter as much. Like in the American version, the red tape was, the Spectrum will keep out Wi-Fi.
I don't remember them actually having an explanation for the red tape in the American one. I thought they just...
There's like a whole big flat explanation for it in the American one.
I can understand why they'd want to do that, though, because it's so arbitrary in Kairo.
The only explanation you get for it is she does a printout for no reason in her place with the 7 screens, and all it says is the Forbidden Room, construction materials, red tape. So it's like, you got red tape, you got a Forbidden Room, boom, there you go.
And why would you only have to tape, like, the door frame?
Or a billion window seams. Wouldn't they be able to just go through the door itself? But, alright, fine, like, you don't worry too much about the details necessarily there, nor how anyone somehow figures all this information out. You go to something like when the ghost is talking to the main character and doesn't bother with saying anything, really. He's like, help me. Help you what? What do you want? What is it that you want? Do you want us out? Do you want us here?
But I think that scene is also like a great example of sort of the pros and the cons of this movie, because the scene itself, it was moody and interesting, but it was entirely pointless, and it had a really interesting idea in it when he goes and he puts his hands on the shoulder of the ghost, and the ghost is actually there.
That was fantastic. I love that.
It's like, it's a terrible scene and a great scene at the same time.
I disagree with it being pointless, though, because it like you said, like it was part of... I see. The thing is, I don't know if I can defend my stance of it, of like, well, it might have been pointless to telling you anything, but it made you feel something there, and that was the point.
But then the whole film becomes nothing but set pieces trying to create feelings, and while that can work at times, when it's so disjointed
and 2 hours long.
Yes, I had more of an issue with that. Well, not even I noticed it more the first time I watched it than the second, because the second I knew what it was going in. And the first time it was more of a... I think because our main characters are so caught up in something that is beyond them and ununderstandable, that's why I was okay with the film also being ununderstandable in the way it was structured.
That could also be used as an excuse.
And just in case anybody wants to be like, oh, Mike and Dustin just like didactic, straightforward movies, just remember, we loved Eraserhead.
Loved Eraserhead, we love Mother, Annihilation, which I got the title right this time, I think.
And like, I didn't realize going into this movie that it would be so disjointed and that it would be more of a thematic piece than anything else. I often find that thematic pieces tend to also be character pieces, though, and they kind of eschew narrative in order to focus on those other two things, and the theme sort of gets delivered to you out of character development. There's very little character development here. Other than, oh man, I can't remember his name. It was like Harushimi or
Kawishima? The one with the unbuttoned...
The first guy, the guy who like logged onto the internet for the first time.
Yeah, it's his movie. Exactly, he was the one that has the arc. And when I was saying that it was a bit of a love story, I would say it's a love story between him and Haru, not a love story between him and Mishi.
But then he meets that girl with the car.
I'm assuming that's Mishi?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't even realize that was a character that had been introduced earlier in the film.
Yeah, she was the one who was working at the garden center.
Yeah, no, I know the character, but I didn't realize that
she
carried it through to the end. I thought that was just somebody that he met
randomly
in the midst of the apocalypse.
No, that was, the stories were completely separate until that point, and that's when they were meeting for the first time, which I think I wrote it down. I think it was actually an hour and a half into the film.
Yeah, that sounds about right. But yeah, he's devastated over the loss of Haru.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, completely. And it was all about him. Like, he starts off as someone who, like, he's really, like, he's just, like, playing games and living in his room. He doesn't, like, he says at the very end of the movie, the girl says, "Hey, do you have any friends?" And he's like, "Well, I had one." And he's talking about Haru in that way.
Which is kind of mean to Mishi, like, she's sitting right there.
And, well, they just met. I think it would be a little presumptuous to be like, you're my best friend.
And he,
if everyone else is gone,
he does...
Default.
To kind of argue into that, they may have just met, but he very, quickly sort of takes comfort by putting his head on her shoulder in the car, and so he falls into that pretty easily. But
yeah, in extreme situations, a relationship can form a little quicker, and I totally get. I mean, she calls him her friend at the end of the movie.
Yes,
saying that she's finally happy just sitting around with her friend, who disappears the next frame, basically.
Yeah, which again makes it, like, I think she knew that was happening or was about to happen.
I do find it's also strange because there's a framing sequence on the boat. And any movie that has a framing sequence that is that brief, like Titanic kind of pissed me off in that way too with that framing sequence. I kind of wondered if it was necessary. Even though I liked that ending, I liked the black smudge on the floor where he was sitting and her saying that, and
she's just sort of going nuts from the loneliness already.
Yeah, but it was so weird after spending like 2 hours in Tokyo with this stuff going on, with the forbidden rooms, with the characters and the internet and the loneliness and the suicides, to all of a sudden be back on the ship. I mean, it's no less jarring than anything else in the movie, but...
Yeah.
The one thing that we found a little...
The movie kind of does that to you.
The one thing we found a little odd at the end there while watching it was, so the ghosts are bleeding through our technology, any place where there is technology, so what do? They get on a boat and they go where there's a signal. It's like, let's find this signal and have the exact same problem occur again, as opposed to...
Yeah, we're doomed to just continue this on. Like, how do you solve this when it's really like the afterlife is out to get you?
Are they? That's the thing. They don't seem to really do much of anything.
They don't seem aggressive. They seem present, but not hostile, unless it serves to make the scene creepier.
And any of their interactions with people work out in just odd ways.
And the way that they're presented is also different. Some of them look more solid, some of them look more shadowy.
That one, I think the first legitimate ghost we see, that woman who just starts walking towards the camera and then goes into that little dip, she's so creepy.
I did like when he hides behind the couch or chair and he looks under, and I was like, okay, her legs aren't there. She better be up top, because that's a good ghost moment.
And I loved the slow movement, period, as she's walking. Because if you saw somebody walking at you in slow motion...
Yeah, it was that dip that got it for me, because it made it so much more dance-like.
Yeah.
She must have been on some sort of wires there to make those movements. Yeah. It was great.
In that sequence, I was also noting, I think I don't know if this is a way out of left field thought, but it was also a little Blade Runner-esque. Like the scene of Rachel walking out in slow motion in Blade Runner, and some other little things to do with the music and the world. We're just pulling those strings for me that time.
I can maybe see some of that.
I'd almost think more Pod People in the sense of you'll have those scenes where someone interacts with a ghost, and you won't know what happens, and afterwards, they've changed somewhat. The main character in that scene with the physical ghost there, they discuss some stuff, and then he's found later by Mishi up at Haru's suicide spot, and at that point, he's gone. He's done for.
It is, like, as you said, it is very disjointed. It's very much like just an essay on the ideas of interconnectivity between people. Because, like, the fact that they talk about this computer program where if two dots get close, they die. Like, that's something you would bring up in an essay about metaphysics.
And that's where I find the plot gets a little plot droppy, where they're sort of ham-fisting you with a couple of these ideas, and then just showing a whole lot of set pieces around it.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen any of Kurosawa's other films, but I hear that they're very similar. They're very theme-heavy. He kind of hits you over the head with it, and he doesn't seem to like contemporary Japanese culture.
There are a lot of these
films. If this
films.
film's anything to go by.
Yeah, there are a lot of these films that came out around this time, and Japanese folklore and ghosts are very heavily influenced by material stuff we have. You have umbrella ghosts. You have ghosts that live in your toilet. Like, they're just any sort of material thing.
Ghost on a VHS tape.
Exactly. You have Ring and this, which came out around the same time, and it's just technology. Now you just add ghosts to it, and that seems to be very, very Japanese.
Yes. Like, all right, if there is a ghosts on the internet, what's that deal?
And Japanese ghosts are never good. They're kind of assholes.
So Ringu came out like 3 years before this movie, and I remember while we were watching, I did mention, like in the first 20 minutes, I said, there are some definite similarities here as far as technology and ghosts, and Dustin gave me the same talk where the whole ghosts and material things in Japanese culture. But yeah, I mean, there's probably so many of these themes that run through all J-horror.
Just like we have so many themes in our horror movies.
Well, and this was a big boom of J-horror as well, right?
This is kind of like the centerpiece. I think this is one of the things that really started it. If my readings are not completely whacked. I know that in the States, our remakes started around the same time that Kairo.
Certainly at the beginning of the millennium, we were getting a whole lot of remakes.
And our J-horror fascination ended with the remake of Kairo, Pulse, because that kind of tanked.
The balloon burst.
Yeah. Which is interesting then if it starts in Japan with Kairo and ends.
Well, it didn't start in Kairo, but I think Kairo
The Ring,
was
I think,
one
was
of
the first.
Oh yeah, that's right. You said it was 3 years before.
I think Kairo was one of the ones that it's like the exclamation point, because the way it was received in Japan and the way it was received here when it did finally make it here. I think a lot of people do look at Kairo as the centerpiece of the whole J-horror movement that had captured the hearts and minds of studio executives and cinemagoers. But yeah, I mean, there is some symmetry. It's a little askew, but having it end with Pulse is kind of funny. It's also kind of funny considering sort of the nature of the story of Kairo being somewhat technology-based and apocalyptic.
Yeah. And but I think it was also stronger here in 2001 because I think a story like this could only be told on quote-unquote early days
because we had
technology.
no idea what was going on with the internet.
Exactly, and the character here doesn't as well. He had to write down how to click on something to bookmark it. It's adorable from a modern standpoint.
I do feel that 2001 is still a little late for that kind of behavior.
Well, it's funny because I didn't know when this film had been made when I first sat down to watch it, and if you had asked me, I probably would have said anywhere between like 93 and 96.
I would have guessed that
too. Because there's certain scenes, like the computers, I honestly loved looking at everything on the computer screens because I'm seeing those like almost DOS buttons that he was clicking on, the little pixel mouse.
He had Windows 95. It was great.
Yeah, that was like, I don't even want to say a nostalgia trip. It was just like, it was a flashback.
It was weird seeing flat screen monitors and dial-up modems.
And I think that as an instructor, she was terrible. Haru was terrible because telling him how to bookmark something, just show him. Because click on the bookmark.
Yeah, you have a computer right there.
There's 30 computers right there.
And there's drop-down menus you got to go into. Like, it's not just right there on the screen.
Click on. She didn't even say right-click. She just said click on it.
And she said,
on what?
Hit the print screen button.
I've actually read this.
That copies it, but you got to do something with it afterwards.
I actually read this article where the author was referring to the film as a technology movie made for Luddites, which I kind of really got and have clung to since reading that, because looking at so much of this movie, the characters, they don't handle technology well. They don't deal with technology well. There seems to be this weird, not quite full understanding of the technology that they're using. They're very clumsy with it, and the description of the use of the technology and the way the characters articulate it is very... It's like Kurosawa is writing for people who have never seen a computer or the internet.
He's like, well, I'm going to change the internet a little bit to make it fit my themes better.
I was kind of fascinated, and I'm also more frustrated because of that.
Yeah, well, because it's like an internet that exists if there was no such thing as Google. If you just had to go from these isolated web pages with no way of getting in between them.
Well, he had that God, I don't even remember what you called them. It was like AOL. He had an internet service.
It was Uranus was
Yes.
the one that he was using.
Yeah, you put the disk in and it loads the program, and then you connect to whoever your internet provider is, and that is your gateway to the World Wide Web.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was hijacked immediately, sent to the Forbidden Room, and lost his shit.
Which I'm guessing was something that was embedded or in the disk somehow.
Yeah, like in the install disk.
But how long was that install disk sitting there on his desk, which he happened to have? I love how he had this computer. He had everything he needed to hook up to the internet sitting there.
But it seemed to be the first time he ever did.
Well, I made the argument...
he had sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I made the argument to Dustin that a lot of people had computers for years before they hooked up to the internet.
Absolutely. That I had computers in my home for years and years before we got the internet. I grew up in a very rural area, so it was years before we had the option of getting the internet.
You can't get more rural than Tokyo.
Exactly. But this guy, if you look at what's around in his apartment, there did seem to be some CDs and stuff there, so maybe he was just a gamer. Maybe he was sitting there playing Tomb Raider but didn't have any inclination to...
But his keyboard and everything seemed to be buried under other stuff.
That was hilarious.
It was like nothing was in use. It was just something he had kicking around.
Blow it off?
Yeah, he had to blow off his keyboard.
It's like, when was the last time this was out? So,
yeah.
How much J-horror have you seen?
So Amelia's a big J-horror fan, so I've seen an amount. I've seen the original Ringu movies. I've seen the Ju-on films. We have watched other ones, but probably they're all the big names that I've seen.
So contextually, with what you've seen, where would you put Kairo?
It's definitely on an artsier branch of J-horror. If you were, when we sat down to watch this expecting the typical J-horror experience, it did not give us that at all. But then after the movie, we were both like, that was good. We literally were just fascinated by what is happening here. Why is it the apocalypse now? Why did the stakes get that large? In terms of quality, I really enjoyed it. I enjoy films that play to theme more than plot. Probably I like that to a bit too much of a wild degree, as people who know me will attest. Which is why, I know we're kind of on different sides of the argument here, but I came in somewhat expecting that.
Well, I'm happy we didn't disappoint then.
I do enjoy movies that spark conversation and dialogue, and I always love having somebody who enjoys a movie to talk to me about a movie that maybe I did not enjoy as much, because if somebody else pulled something out of it there's something there, and maybe I just didn't see it. Because sometimes just your mood or your environment can have such an impact on your viewing experience. And you've already given me like a half a dozen things to kind of think about if I ever revisit this movie. And I've had experiences where I've seen a movie that I didn't like, and then I've watched it with someone who genuinely enjoyed it, and I got it. It's like watching the Star Wars prequels with my kids. I didn't like those movies as much until I saw them through the eyes of my children, and then I was like, oh, I get it now.
And I certainly enjoy finding all sorts of things in movies, all the little gems, and I will pull stuff from movies that nobody else will, which is why I like Lucy as much as I do, despite the fact that it is a dumb movie. But this one, I feel it had many more moments which pulled me out of the movie, and I'm looking at it, and it's that kind of thing that gets rid of my immersion.
Right. I guess, personally, on that note, I also enjoy when I watch a movie and I don't really like it, or I don't get it while I'm watching it, but then like later on I might be grocery shopping or washing the dishes and going like, God damn it, I did like that movie.
You'll love to hate it.
I think I just found it so... I think it was the disjointed nature of it and some of the technical aspects of it that detracted from the more artful side of it.
You had issue with a lot of the ways he used the camera, and this is something I disagreed with you big time. I liked a lot of the odd camera movements.
Yeah. I was hoping we could get into some of the real technical stuff of this, because it is very not plot-based. I think the plot is probably one of the lesser interesting areas to talk about it from.
I think that's why I noticed the technical stuff so much, because it was so easy to just phase out of kind of the story, and seeing the actual physical movement of the camera and the placement of the music and the lighting, placement of foreground and background objects just super stood out. And the one that drove me kind of the most nuts was when they were in the computer science lab, which for some reason there's odd piles of industrial junk just in little weird random places, so that they could be in the foreground or background when the camera moves. But there was the two people, I will never remember their names, the main character, the Luddite guy, and
Kawashima and Haru was the instructor.
Okay, so it was Kawashima and Haru. They were standing in the computer science lab. The camera does this very locked pan.
It almost strafes around them.
Yeah, it looked very much like a first-person shooter, how it went from one character to like another character, and then it backed up and it moved around a pile of junk, and it sort of tracked to screen right as another character walked in, and then it pulled away, and it was so conspicuous that it drove me nuts.
Whereas I loved it.
All right, well, if you loved it, what do you think it was trying to say with that shot?
I don't think it was trying to say anything. I think, well...
It was to say, look what I can do with the camera.
It was trying to back away and move suspiciously behind that pile of electronics in order to point out just how much we have these devices around us, how we're surrounded by it. And, of course, that's the big theme that they're constantly hammering home. We've got all this technology, but are we actually connected to these people? And it was also trying to just set up where when the third character walks in from the side, everything will be in the shot. So it's sort of preparing in advance, a minute in advance for that.
One thing I liked with the camera a lot that I noticed was how many shots were done in this movie through windows or through sheets, so that everything was kind of a frame within a frame, like you had a window on a computer screen.
There were some really nice compositions. I'm not disputing the artfulness of the film, but sometimes I just felt like the director was drawing way too much attention to himself.
Okay.
A little head up its own ass sort of thing.
And there was also a scene where a character was talking and the camera just panned away from them while they were talking.
Was that the scene in the Forbidden Room though?
I don't think it.
Okay, because I remember the one scene when Kirishima was actually inside the Forbidden Room and he was talking to the ghost there. I remember loving just how that was shot. I think it was very still for a lot.
It was.
Of that scene. It was very like theatrical in that it was just him there giving a monologue.
You talking about after he went in to get gas?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I like that scene. I like that, even though I feel that scene is sort of narratively pointless. I think the construction of that scene is great.
I'm also going to go tell you why I don't think it's narratively pointless. Because that's kind of him getting infected with the depression virus. And then we see that as he's rescued by Michi, and he was sitting near Haru's stain. He was completely depressed and out of it. They're in the car, and she starts crying, and he starts comforting her. He's able to pull himself out of his depression to reach out and connect with another person.
For all the good it does.
Yeah, it doesn't. But I think it adds some thematic hopefulness. Like, we're all going to die. We're all going to be out of here one day. But if for a little moment we can connect with someone, then that's beauty in itself.
Which is another weird monologue you just reminded me of, where they were talking about, I forget who it was who was deathly afraid of dying, and our good old Luddite, whose name you just said, I swore to myself I'd remember. And Kawashima talks about how there is a point to life, and that doesn't necessarily even fit with the theme of the movie and our disconnectedness with each other. It's like, what is...
That was on the train, right? Where he was like, we're just going to get away from this and we're going to do our own thing.
I do remember the scared of death monologue. There are a good number of monologues in the movie.
That's how everything is given to us.
I remember, because there's also the boss of the greenhouse gives a monologue on what's the point of friendship. And, don't go and reach out to someone because it'll probably come back and hurt you.
Which brings up the most deliberate sitting action ever done in a film.
That was another one of those conspicuous moments where he sort of moves slowly forward. He looks down at the chair, moves his hips, and he just sort of maneuvers himself into the chair, and then he sits
and crosses his leg,
and then looks back up like, I did it.
and then he continues to talk.
There's also that line though where someone was basically talking about how lonely they were, and somebody said, "What about family?" And they were like, "Well, they don't count."
Or no, none of them count. They're irrelevant. I think that's a deliberate choice of words.
Okay.
Assuming a proper translation and a contextual understanding.
You're right. It might have been a deliberate choice, but if the film is not in English. I think that's another point we should point out while we're discussing it, is that this is a film from another culture, and as much as we can interpret it, there may be things that we are missing or misinterpreting along the way.
There are always very subtle differences between words within translations. I know several languages, and that is a definite huge thing. And Japanese is one I know a little bit of, and I notice little changes in the dialogue and what was actually said. Nothing huge, nothing super conspicuous, but if you're trying to do something that is heavily artful and where very specific word choices matter, we're going to be missing out on something.
There have been times where I've watched some of the anime series that I own, because I don't generally watch dubs. I do the subs. I remember with Cowboy Bebop, somebody was arguing that it's one of the best English dubs ever made, so I was like, okay, well, what's so great about it? So I had my English subtitles, which were translating the original Japanese language track, and I played the English dub.
Oh, I didn't know. That's cool.
And you see just all the differences, the colloquialisms that they introduce, and condense things and expand things.
Because they're trying to make it fit the lips.
Localization is about bringing those cultural nuances to put it into a form where it's not necessarily what's been said originally, but it's giving you the same feeling from it.
But sometimes they'll censor stuff unnecessarily, however, or they'll focus more on making it work with the lip movement, which will take away from the meaning.
Yes.
I just found so much of it was different, and it was different in such subtle ways. I'm also a stickler for word choice, and they would go for whatever was the most commonly used or simpler or faster to read, I don't know, or say, because of the lip movements. And it took away some of the sort of deeper meaning to some of the lines that the characters were saying, in my opinion. So, yeah, I'm very sensitive to translations, and I realize we may not have gotten the purity of the experience.
To keep it on the technical side, something else I noticed that I wanted to get your take on. Did either of you note the color composition of the film.
Dark.
Muddy.
Yeah,
Blurry.
Like I said, a lot of the colors were bold but desaturated, and that got heavier as the film went on. Like really, there's hardly any blue in the movie whatsoever. Anytime you get a shot of the sky, it's complete white, like a blank screen. I think the only blue I noticed is on Kuishima's shirt in one scene, and that's early in the film where we also get a bunch of greenhouse scenes. But as the film goes on, it gets more and more bland and industrial and very dark. Like there's a lot of just black and heavy grays, and a lot of scenes that are shot in dark rooms.
I did
or
notice
off
that
of the screens.
at the beginning of the film, you saw more people with more colorful clothing, red dresses, red pants, things like that.
And then when it gets to the scene with burning airplane, that scene's almost in sepia tone.
Yeah, very much.
And most of the time I thought that was keeping everything dark to keep the special effects easier to do. And because that's how they did their ghosts, a lot of them were just sort of in shadows, which was beautiful. It was gorgeous. And it also looked like it was filmed damn near on a camcorder, sort of very lo-fi stuff. So,
yeah. But that suited
almost
the digital themes as well.
I haven't done a bunch of research since we watched this last night, but I would be curious to know more about the budget and the resources that they had, and I'd also be curious to know how this kind of compares to other films in Kurosawa's oeuvre as well.
What I can say, looking at a lot of other J-horror that I've seen, there's certainly a heck of a lot more digital stuff. I see a lot more physical effects, a lot more makeup, and a lot of that makeup is also really poor, but almost intentionally bad.
Yeah, it's theatrical, I would say, rather than poor. Like you're meant to be aware that it's a person in makeup.
Yeah, it's a very different feel than you'd get from a lot of other J-horror, for sure.
I like how Billy's taken on the role of anytime something really negative is said, he kind of softens the blow a little bit.
I'm just such a staunch defender.
Jumping in the way.
Because we're seeing like webcam footage a lot of the time, I think it's the right choice to use those digital effects.
I thought that webcam stuff was done really well.
I question whether or not there was any webcams whatsoever. For example, when she basically eats the one camera, she's grabbing at nothing in the air.
Yeah.
You're just seeing the rooms.
Could be seeing it through the eyes of the ghosts. Maybe the ghosts' eyes are cameras.
I don't think the perspective or anything like that actually matters necessarily. Who's filming doesn't matter. The fact that you're being filmed, the fact that you're on the internet, the fact that people can see you in your home in your most private of space while at the same time not seeing anything about you. That's the theme that they're going for.
Absolutely.
This could also be a case, I mean, there have been movies that there's been anything, any media, music, books, you experience it and it doesn't quite click with you in the moment, but you revisit it with a greater cultural vocabulary or experience, or you just kind of know what to expect, so you're not necessarily picking at certain specific things anymore, and you're just sort of letting it wash over you. And I kind of wonder if this experience of watching Kairo maybe was that kind of thing, because like I said, I liked the themes and the ideas that were being presented here. I just didn't necessarily like the film as a whole on a sort of
Is there anything you
basis.
would have done to fix it? Like, what would you have liked to see in a version of Kairo that appealed to you?
Well, I felt that tension would be built and then just dropped. Well, actually, no, dropped is... Let me rephrase. There were several moments where tension was built and then it was just left to dissipate, so that you didn't even get that feeling of a lack of closure, so you're still feeling sort of tense. Mm-hmm. And because, I don't need everything explained, I don't need everything, we need the rule book of why the ghosts are here and what they're doing, but some sort of inclination of what the impending doom is, even if it was a character just guessing, because even the character in the library who guessed...
Even when M. Night Shyamalan came in and just told us.
Yeah, and they were like, all right, look, you want some explanations? Here are your explanations.
He gave an explanation, but it didn't actually...
make internally consistent sense.
Yeah, and it didn't... It could have planted a seed so that you could have expanded on it in your own head, you could have started reading into things... And I didn't feel that his explanation of the ghosts, all it did for me was confuse it more.
Mm-hmm.
And
less explanation probably would have been better here.
Yeah.
So if you would just cut that scene.
Maybe.
Because do you think that scene set up an expectation for it to resolve with more of a plot?
I think no. I think it gave an expectation for internal consistency. If you didn't have that scene, then we'd be left guessing. But with that scene, we're like, okay, here's the reason, but now stuff isn't meshing with that. What I would have done personally is either remove that scene completely and have the ghost give a vague notion as to what they're trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish, and that we're left guessing from that, or I would have had a bunch of people put in opposing guesses, and you're trying to piece it all together, knowing that nobody really knows what's going on, and you're just, once again, left guessing. But to give us sort of a consistent explanation that is inconsistent with what's going on, that is jarring to me in a way that is negative.
Right. To go on a line where we keep mentioning Shyamalan, have either of you seen The Happening?
Yes. That movie is hilarious.
It is.
It is so bad, it's hilarious.
That is a feel-good movie to sit back and watch. But it's reminiscent here. I think it's important to talk about it because that's another movie which is ostensibly a horror, where the horror is coming from people killing themselves. Whereas that movie kind of removes any semblance of depression and isolation from it. It's just literally people flatly killing themselves with no reason.
Except for the depression and isolation you feel socially after watching it.
They give the reason. That reason is plants defending themselves using spores.
That's what I'm saying. Like,
and that's perfectly
fine. They give a reason, and it is internally consistent throughout the film. But I like Kairo a lot more than I like The Happening.
Well, Kairo's trying to say something with their reasoning, whereas The Happening isn't. It's more of a slasher as opposed to a psychological horror. And those are two very distinct genres. Even if it is people committing suicide as the end result, how you get there is still drastically different, and The Happening is not creating any sort of mood or anything. And then you have the stupid scene of the wind coming at them, and it's just funny.
you have a climax that involves mood rings. Whereas here, I would argue the climax of Kairo is that moment I mentioned earlier of him comforting Michi in the car.
I can see that. I can accept that reasoning.
But we should also move into the judgment portion.
We should.
コーヒー入れよっか。
ミチ、
何？
私死んじゃうのかな、このまま。
そんなことないよ。
そうだよね。ずっとこのまんまなんだよね。
We will start with Billy, as you are the guest and we have that right.
Perfect. I don't think you'll be surprised. I'm going to label this movie a masterpiece.
Oh.
I do think relevant. We're on computers more now than any before. When I'm, just sitting scrolling through Twitter at 3 a.m., am I really interacting with anybody in that way, or are computers a way to keep me isolated? And I think the depiction of depression in this movie, it hit home a lot of points of how people with depression act and interact. When Michi's roommate was just grabbing that blanket to wrap around her and just saying that she was cold, and the way they just faded into the walls, there's a lot in this movie that it is a series of scenelets, but each one is effective to me.
Fair enough.
I'll steal number 2.
All right.
I agree that it's entirely relevant. We do spend so much time online. I would disagree that the portrayal of depression is super good. I suffer from depression a whole lot myself, and I know a lot of people who suffer from depression. And like that scene with her grabbing at the blanket, there was fear in there. That wasn't depression, in my eyes. There were some good points for depression here and there spattered about, but I think fear was always an underlying tone, which is not something that tends to come with depression. And I think that a lot of the themes that he's trying to show, he's not doing a particularly good job of. I'd put this into museum piece. It's something that's worth taking a look at. There's a lot of good composition. There's a lot of good creepy moments. But as a whole, it sort of falls apart on what it's trying to say, unless you start reading what he was trying to say and have to look at external sources.
I'm also going to go with museum piece, which I'm sure is not going to surprise anyone. As I said, I love what this movie is trying to do, and I love what this movie actually says, but I don't really like how the movie goes about doing it. I don't love how it's put together, and I commented while we were watching it to Dustin that I sort of feel like all those moments in between scenes in other movies is what this movie is made up of.
And I call it the J-horror equivalent of the French Connection for that.
Yes. You mentioned tone poem earlier.
I'd agree. Tone poem.
Yeah, I think tone poem isn't a bad description for this movie, and it is kind of obtuse, and it's ambitious, it's inventive, so credit for that, and I think it's important for where it sits in the whole sort of J-horror canon and horror cinema and Japanese cinema. But yeah, just as a sit down and kind of watch it, and this is the movie that I'm going to be able to revisit, and it has impacted meaning for me, not so much. So,
and at the end of the day, when I can't remember really anything about it when I saw it the first time, and if I spend half the movie being like, why the heck would that even happen? That doesn't make any sense inside or outside the movie. Those are major down points for any movie, calling it a masterpiece. It has to suck you in.
I am very happy to disagree with both of you. I think it generated some very interesting discussion, and I think it wouldn't have gotten that discussion if both of you were like, oh yeah, I love it, it's a great film. You'd
be surprised. You would be surprised. Listen to our Martyrs thing. We both love that, and we went on and on and on. But hopefully everybody else online will join in the conversation and tell us what they think about Kairo.
And I hope this doesn't discourage Billy from ever coming on the show again.
No, just maybe next time I'll come on with something a little safer like Zoolander.
Masterpiece, obviously.
It's on the list.
It is on the list. But so was Hitman, and so is building sounds from Fox News. There's some weird things on the list. Blowjob is on the list.
So Billy, you, as I mentioned earlier on, you have your own podcast, Scooby Doos or Don'ts. Do you have anything to plug?
I do. I also have a second podcast called Film Runners, where I talk about movies with Michael Walsh-Kelly and Incha Fitzpatrick. Our rule on that podcast is just that it has to be a movie that one of us hasn't seen before, which has led to some interesting choices. I think our latest episode that we just put out is on 1990's The Ambulance, starring Eric Roberts and James Earl Jones.
Well, if you guys ever want any weird recommendations, hit us up, because I got some stuff for you.
I'm sure I might take you up on that. Well, I want to thank you both for having me on. It's been a blast. I'm ecstatic that I got to talk about this film and get a lot of the ideas about it off my chest. Both Michael and Incha had seen it before, so I couldn't talk about it on Film Runners.
So this was a wish fulfillment.
This was my Make-A-Wish, and you both were especially cruel because of it.
And if anybody else wants to be especially cruel, hit us up on our YouTube comments, or Facebook, or Twitter, or Instagram. We're on all the social media. Be sure to check out our WordPress blog, where we're actually updating it with new content again. And what else is there? The Patreon. Check out our Patreon campaign. If you like the show and want to support the show beyond just sharing it among family and friends on your social media, I think we've got some interesting reward tiers. Check it out, see what you think, and maybe leave us some cash.
You can find me on Twitter at @TheBillySeguire, Seguire. I don't know.
We will have links and all that up for people as well. So. No worries.
Yeah, and we'll put some links in the show notes and stuff for Billy's podcasts and where you can find him. And what is next week? Next week's going to be an All Things Considered episode.
It is.
So yeah, thanks again, Billy, for joining us. It was great having you.
Happy to be here.
And thanks everybody else for checking out the show. Be sure to catch us next week on FYC. And until then, I was your host, Mike.
I'm Dustin.
And I was your guest, Billy.
Take care.
Ta-ta.
And hello to all our listeners who catch the show on YouTube, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Google Play. Mr. Boogity.